90% of people who try to train their mind quit within a week. Not because the practice is hard, but because nobody ever told them what they were actually trying to do. And that single missing piece of information has cost more people more years of spinning their wheels than any lack of effort or commitment ever could. I know this because I was one of those people. I spent a long time convinced that the problem was me, that some people just had sharper minds, clearer focus, stronger mental discipline, that I was built slightly wrong somewhere underneath the hood. And the worst part is, I was genuinely trying. I wasn't lazy about it. I'd sit down, close my eyes, try to hold a thought or a picture in my head, and within a few seconds, it would blur and dissolve like breath on a cold window. Every single time. I'd read the books, I'd watch the videos. Everyone kept saying the same thing in slightly different words. Believe harder. Want it more. Raise your vibration. And I kept doing exactly that, and nothing kept changing. The image would collapse, the focus would scatter, and I'd walk away thinking the problem was somewhere inside my character. What nobody said, not once in any of those books or videos, was this: the visual cortex is a muscle, literally a trainable biological system, and like any muscle that has never been put under deliberate load, it cannot perform on demand, no matter how motivated the person attached to it happens to be. The moment I understood that, everything I'd been experiencing suddenly made sense. It wasn't a mindset failure. It was a training gap. I'd been asking a system that had never been conditioned to do something it had no baseline capacity for. And the frustrating thing is that the solution to this problem has existed for a very long time, sitting quietly in texts that most people walk right past. If any of this is landing for you, if you've ever sat down to visualize something and felt it dissolve before you could hold it, subscribe and hit like. It means you'll be here when we go deeper. And what's coming next in this explanation is the part that genuinely shifted something in how I understand the mind. The thing that finally cracked it open for me wasn't a new book or a modern technique. It started with a question I stumbled onto, almost by accident. If focus is a trainable capacity, then what were the people doing it best actually training with? Not what were they thinking about or believing in. What specific physical method were they using to build that capacity in the first place? And the answer, when I found it, stopped me cold. Because it wasn't new. It wasn't cutting edge. It was old. Genuinely old. The kind of old that makes you realize modern self-improvement has been reinventing a wheel that was already turning perfectly centuries ago. There's a practice documented in a classical Sanskrit text compiled by a teacher named Swami Svatmarama that lists it as one of 6 foundational methods for preparing the mind. Not for relaxing the mind, not for calming it, for sharpening it into something precise and controllable. The specific outcome the practice aims for has a Sanskrit name, ekagrata, which translates roughly to one-pointed focus. A single thread of attention held without breakage. The tool used to develop that capacity is a candle flame. Not as a symbol, not as an ambient mood setter, as a precision instrument for conditioning the visual cortex through a specific neurological mechanism that happens whether you believe in the practice or not. That last part matters more than anything else I'm going to say tonight. Because the mechanism isn't dependent on your buy-in. It runs on biology. And when I finally understood what was actually happening in the brain during this practice, the skeptical part of me, the part that had dismissed a dozen things like this before, went completely quiet. What I was looking at wasn't ancient mysticism dressed up in modern language. It was an engineered solution to a neurological problem, built centuries before anyone had the vocabulary to describe why it worked. Those monastery practitioners weren't meditating to feel peaceful. They were engineering a specific mental output the same way a carpenter engineers a joint, with precision, with method, with repeatable results. That realization landed on me like cold water to the face, because everything I had ever been taught about focus and visualization pointed inward, toward intention, toward feeling, toward some internal state you were supposed to conjure through willpower alone. But these people were pointing at something completely different. They were pointing at a physical process, a trainable sequence of neurological events that produce the outcome reliably, the same way pressing a key on a piano reliably produces a note. The difference between their approach and everything I had tried before was the difference between hoping a muscle grows and actually loading it with resistance until it has no choice but to adapt. And the specific resistance they had identified, the thing that actually loads the visual cortex in a way nothing else quite replicates, was a single point of light in a dark room. Not a screen, not a printed dot on a wall, a living, moving, breathing point of light with a specific quality of luminance that turned out to matter more than I initially understood. I remember the first time I read the description of the practice in full. I was sitting at my desk, late at night, the kind of quiet that makes small sounds louder than they should be, and I had this strange feeling, not excitement exactly, more like the feeling of finding something you lost so long ago you'd stopped looking for it, like the solution had always been sitting right there, and the only reason I hadn't reached it sooner was that everyone around me had been looking in the wrong direction. Those practitioners didn't stumble onto this by accident. They tested it, refined it, passed it forward through generations of serious students, and documented it in a text that has survived longer than most modern institutions. That kind of staying power doesn't happen by accident either. Here's the part where the ancient method and the modern science finally shake hands. And when I understood this connection clearly for the first time, something in my thinking permanently rearranged itself. The brain operates across a range of electrical frequencies. You've probably heard of some of them: beta, alpha, theta, delta. In everyday waking life, most people spend the majority of their time in beta, which runs fast and loud and is excellent for solving immediate problems, but terrible for generating clear internal imagery. The mental static you feel when you try to visualize something and it keeps dissolving, that static has a physical signature. It's the sound of a brain running too hot, too fast, too scattered to hold a signal steady. Alpha is different. Alpha runs slower, somewhere between 8 and 13 cycles per second. And in that frequency range, the brain's noise-generating systems go noticeably quiet. The inner critic softens. The mental chatter drops in volume. And the brain's capacity to generate and sustain an internally driven image increases dramatically. Not because you're trying harder, but because the interference has been reduced. Now here's the part that made me sit completely still for about 2 full minutes when I first read it. Sustained visual focus on a single bright point, specifically a flame, drives the brain toward alpha naturally, without effort, without any technique beyond the act of looking. The gaze does the frequency shift for you. You don't have to achieve anything or reach for a state you've never touched. You just have to hold your eyes on the right point long enough, and your own nervous system makes the transition on its own. The flame is not a symbol of calm. It is a biological trigger for a specific brain state, and that brain state is the foundation everything else is built on. The thing about alpha state that nobody talks about is what it actually feels like from the inside. And the reason nobody talks about it is that most people have never deliberately entered it and known that's where they were. It doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't feel like a trance or some altered experience that announces itself. It feels like the volume on a television that's been running in the background all day, finally getting turned down. You don't realize how loud it was until the quiet arrives. I noticed it for the first time about 4 nights into using this practice consistently. I was sitting in my kitchen, late enough that the street outside had gone still. One small candle on the table in front of me, the kind you'd put out for a dinner and never actually use. The wax was soft and slightly warm smelling, not perfumed, just the clean, faint smell of something burning slowly and steadily. And about 60 seconds into holding my gaze on the tip of that flame, I noticed that the thought I'd been carrying around all day, a low-level hum of worry about something I needed to handle, had simply gone quiet. Not resolved, not pushed away, just quiet. The way a signal drops when you move out of range. That was alpha. And what I didn't fully understand yet was that in that quieted state, something else was happening underneath the surface. The brain's filtering system, the part that normally intercepts internally generated images and dismisses them as not real, was losing its grip. The critical layer was thinning, and the space that opened up in its place was exactly the kind of receptive, open, unhurried attention that makes deep mental conditioning possible. The flame had done that, not my effort, not my intention. The act of looking at a single bright point in a dim room had triggered a biological chain reaction that no amount of trying could have manufactured on its own. What happened next in that chain reaction is the part I genuinely did not expect, and it's the part that separates this practice from every other focus technique I had tried before it. After holding the gaze long enough, when I finally let my eyes close, something was waiting for me in the dark behind my eyelids. A soft, floating impression of the flame. Not imagined, not constructed. Just there, hovering in my inner visual field like a signal that had burned itself gently into the back of my eye. I stayed very still. My breathing had already slowed into the steady 4-count rhythm I'd been using before I started. And I watched that floating image the way you'd watch a soap bubble, close enough to see it clearly, careful enough not to breathe on it. Here's what the science says is happening in that moment. The light-sensitive cells in the retina, after being focused on a bright point for 60 to 90 seconds, become temporarily depleted at exactly that spot. When the eyes close, the surrounding cells are still active, and the contrast between them produces the residual impression, a kind of echo of the original signal. Your brain receives that echo through the same pathways it uses to process everything you actually see. The primary visual cortex fires. The neural circuits light up. And critically, the brain at the hardware level cannot distinguish between that retinal echo and a real incoming visual signal from the outside world. It processes both the same way. That's not a metaphor. That's not a motivational reframe. That's the literal biological mechanism. And when I understood that, really understood it, the question that had been nagging at me for years finally had a clean answer. The reason visualization works when it's done correctly is not because of belief. It's because a well-formed internal image and a real external perception are, to your nervous system, the same category of event. The candle teaches your brain to generate that category of signal on demand. And what you do with that capability once it's built is where everything gets genuinely interesting. Most people have no idea that their own inner voice is actively destroying their ability to visualize. And the terrifying part is that it happens so fast, you never even catch it doing it. You close your eyes. You start to build an image. And before it has any real form at all, something inside your head quietly says, "This is silly. This isn't working. You're just making this up." And the image collapses. Every time. Not because the image was weak, because the voice got there first. What I've just described is the default mode network doing exactly what it was designed to do. It runs constantly in the background of your waking life, generating self-referential commentary, assessing, judging, comparing, filing things under real or not real. In ordinary beta state, that network is loud and fast, and it processes your internally generated images the same way a very skeptical editor processes a first draft. It finds the gaps, flags the uncertainty, and shuts the whole thing down before it gets any traction. But here's what changed for me once I understood what alpha state was actually doing to that system. In alpha, the default mode network quiets. Not completely. Not like a switch being flipped. More like a room where someone finally turned the overhead lights down low. The shapes are still there, but the harshness is gone. The editor is still present, but he's stopped leaning over your shoulder. And in that softer, more open state, something genuinely different starts to happen with the images you generate internally. They hold. They don't collapse within 2 seconds. They have weight and texture, and they stay in place long enough for you to actually do something with them. I noticed this shift happening around the 3rd session. I was sitting in the same spot, same candle, same quiet kitchen. And after the gaze cycle, I closed my eyes and tried to hold a simple image. Just a door, a specific door I knew well. And for the first time, it didn't dissolve. It sat there, solid and clear, and I could look at the grain of the wood and the worn paint around the handle. That was the first time I genuinely understood what trained visualization felt like, and it felt nothing like what I had been doing before. What I didn't realize until much later was that the afterimage itself was doing something even more sophisticated than I had first understood. I had been thinking of it as a warm-up, a way to activate the visual cortex before the real practice began. But it's more precise than that. The retinal echo that appears when you close your eyes after the gaze practice is not just an activation signal. It's a template. Your brain, in processing that echo, is rehearsing the exact neural sequence it uses to process real incoming visual data. It is literally practicing the act of seeing something that isn't physically in front of you. And the more times it runs that sequence, the more fluent it becomes at it. Think of it like this. If you wanted to learn to play a specific chord on a guitar, the fastest way to build the muscle memory isn't to think about the chord. It's to place your fingers on the strings and press down over and over until the movement stops requiring conscious instruction and just happens. The afterimage is the equivalent of pressing down on the strings. Each cycle of gaze, close, observe, open is one repetition. And the visual cortex, like any trainable system, responds to repetition by building capacity. By the 5th session, I was running 3 to 5 cycles per sitting, and each time I closed my eyes, the image was sharper, steadier, more responsive to my attention without requiring effort to maintain. The floating impression of the flame had stopped feeling like something happening to me and started feeling like something I was doing. That shift in ownership was subtle, but it changed everything about how I approached the rest of the practice. Because once the system starts responding, the question stops being whether this works and becomes something far more interesting. The research that finally made everything click for me was something I came across while trying to understand why the after-image practice felt so different from regular visualization. A team of researchers studying mental imagery found something that, on the surface, sounds almost too clean to be true. When a person generates a vivid internal image with their eyes closed, the primary visual cortex activates in a pattern that is functionally identical to the pattern produced by actually looking at that same thing in the physical world. Same region, same circuits, same type of signal. The brain, at the level where visual processing actually happens, does not file those two experiences in different categories. It processes them through the same hardware. I sat with that for a long time. Because what it means, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, is that the gap between imagining something and perceiving it is not a gap in kind, it is a gap in signal quality. A poorly formed, unstable, flickering internal image produces a weak, inconsistent signal. A clear, stable, high-resolution internal image produces a signal the nervous system treats with the same weight it gives to direct sensory experience. The practice was never about belief. It was about signal strength. And signal strength is trainable. That was the moment the whole thing stopped being interesting to me on an intellectual level and started being urgent on a personal one. Because I had spent years trying to improve my belief and getting nowhere. And here was evidence that what I actually needed to improve was the resolution of the image itself, the clarity and stability of the internal signal, which was something I now had a concrete method to work on. The after-image cycles were not just warm-up, they were the training. Each repetition was building the exact capacity that made the difference between a mental image that dissolved in 2 seconds and one that held long enough to do real work. So let me tell you what this practice is actually building, because this is the part most people skip straight past, and it's the reason the results feel so different from anything else you might have tried. It is not building positive thinking. It is not building confidence in some abstract sense. It is not teaching you to want things more or believe in yourself harder. What it is building is a specific neurological infrastructure. The capacity to generate an internal image that is stable enough, clear enough, and sustained enough that your nervous system registers it as a genuine sensory event rather than a passing thought. That capacity is the foundation. Everything else, the outcomes you want to create, the mental states you want to access, the goals you want to encode into your subconscious processing, all of it depends on that foundation being solid. Without it, you are trying to transmit a signal through a broken antenna. With it, the transmission goes through clean, and the nervous system receives a clear instruction. I think about it like the difference between speaking into a phone with a bad connection and speaking into one where every word lands perfectly. The message might be identical, but only one of them actually gets heard. The candle practice builds the connection. It conditions the antenna. It takes the visual cortex, which for most people has been running on default settings their entire life, and begins the process of upgrading it into something that can generate and hold a signal with enough fidelity that the brain treats it as real. And here is the part that matters most. Once that infrastructure exists, it does not require your constant effort to maintain. Conditioned neural pathways run automatically. You build them through repetition, and then they operate on their own, below the level of conscious thought, quietly shaping how your mind processes everything it encounters. But to get there, the repetition has to happen in the right sequence, with the right structure, or the conditioning does not take hold. And that sequence is more specific than most people expect. Every single person who told you that you need a special setup, a dedicated room, a certain time of day, a specific mental state before you even begin, was unknowingly describing their own barrier and handing it to you as a requirement. I believed that for longer than I want to admit. I had convinced myself that the reason my practice wasn't producing results was environmental. Too much noise, wrong time of day, not enough space, not settled enough mentally to start. And so I kept waiting for the conditions to align, and they never did. Because conditions like that never fully align, and the waiting becomes its own kind of habit. The truth I eventually had to face was much simpler and much less comfortable. The complexity I was adding to this practice was a form of protection. If the conditions were never quite right, I never had to find out whether the practice itself would work for me. I never had to sit with the possibility that I had been doing something genuinely wrong for years. Stripping away all of that invented complexity was harder than it sounds, because it meant accepting that the only thing standing between me and starting was the decision to start. One candle, a reasonably dim room, 5 minutes without interruption. That was the full list. Not a perfect list of conditions I might reach someday. The actual list, right now, with whatever imperfect circumstances happen to be present. The first time I ran the practice with that understanding, something felt different before I even lit the candle. Not dramatic, just cleaner. Like I had stopped carrying something I had been holding for no reason. The room I used wasn't special. It was just a room with the overhead light off and a single candle on the table. The faint smell of warm wax already in the air before I sat down. And that was enough. It turned out that was always enough. What happened inside that practice once I stopped trying to optimize the container and started actually using the tool is where the real story begins. And the first thing I noticed, the thing nobody had described to me in any of the material I had read, was how much the breathing mattered before the gaze even started. Not during, before. I had been going straight from whatever scattered mental state I was in at the end of the day directly into the gaze practice, and the results were inconsistent at best. Some nights the after image was clear and stable. Other nights it was faint, restless, gone within seconds of appearing. The variable I had been ignoring was the state of my nervous system at the moment of entry. The practice works with the biology you bring to it. If you bring a body running on stress and urgency, the descent into alpha takes longer, and the afterimage is weaker because the system is still fighting to stay in high gear. 4 rounds of balanced breathing, 4 counts in through the nose, 4 counts held, 4 counts released through the mouth, done before the gaze opens, changes that entry point completely. I could feel the difference in my chest and shoulders within the first 2 rounds. A kind of softening. Not tiredness, not drowsiness. Just the sensation of a system releasing the grip it had been holding all day without realizing it. By the 4th cycle, the background noise in my head had dropped to something I could actually work underneath. And when my eyes finally opened and settled on the tip of the flame, the quality of attention I brought to it was in a completely different category from anything I had managed before. The gaze landed with a steadiness I hadn't manufactured through effort. The nervous system had been prepared. And what that preparation made possible in the next few minutes was something I had genuinely never experienced before. The moment my eyes settled on the tip of that flame for the first time, with a properly prepared nervous system, I understood immediately that I had been doing something fundamentally different before. Not slightly different, fundamentally different. The quality of attention that landed on that flame was nothing like the scattered, effortful gaze I had been forcing before. It was more like the difference between grabbing something with a tense fist and simply letting it rest in an open hand. The flame sat at the exact point where the wick met the brightest part of the light, and that was where I placed my focus. Not on the body of the flame, not on the general glow, but on that precise apex where the light was sharpest and most defined. There is something specific about fixing attention on a point that small. The mind has nowhere to wander because the target is too precise to hold with anything other than full attention. Within about 20 seconds, I could feel the familiar softening that I now recognize as the early edge of alpha, but it came faster and cleaner than it ever had before, because the breathing had already moved me part of the way there before the gaze even began. The candle flame itself has a quality that I have never been able to fully describe to anyone who hasn't sat with one in a genuinely dark room. It moves constantly, but never randomly. There is a rhythm to it, a slow, lean, and recover. And something about tracking that micro-movement without chasing it keeps the attention calibrated in a way that a static point of light simply does not. The warmth from it was faint but real, a slight heat on the front of my face, and the smell of the wax had deepened in the room by then, something between clean smoke and warm cotton. I held the gaze without counting seconds. I had learned by that point that counting pulled me out of the state I was trying to enter, so I just held until the urge to blink arrived naturally, and when it did, I let it happen without hesitation. The moment my eyes closed after that first gaze cycle, something was different, and I noticed it within the first breath. The after image that appeared was sharper than anything from my earlier sessions. It sat in the center of my inner visual field with a clarity that felt almost physical, a bright outline against the dark, steady enough that I could look at different parts of it the way you look at different parts of something real in front of you. I stayed very still. The breathing continued its 4-count rhythm, in through the nose, hold, out through the mouth, slow and even. And I kept my attention on the image without reaching toward it. This is the part of the practice that took me the longest to get right, because the instinct when something is working is to try harder, to lean in, to grip the thing before it disappears. But the after image does not respond to grip. The moment I applied any kind of mental pressure to hold it, the edges went soft, and it began to fade faster. The practice required the opposite of what every other focused effort in my life had trained me to do. It required me to stay present without being active, attentive without being forceful, alert without being tense. I had to learn to watch the image the way you watch something happen across the street. Close enough to see clearly, relaxed enough not to interfere with what you're seeing. When I finally found that quality of attention, which took several sessions to locate and several more to sustain, the afterimage would hold for stretches that surprised me. 30 seconds, 40, sometimes longer. And during those stretches, something in my relationship to internally generated imagery shifted at a level I could not fully articulate, but could absolutely feel. The visual cortex was learning. The pathways were deepening with each repetition, and what I was about to ask those pathways to do on the final round of each session was the part the whole practice had been building toward. On the final round of each session, I made a mistake that cost me almost 2 weeks of progress. And I only figured out what I was doing wrong because I accidentally stopped doing it. The mistake was this. As the afterimage began to fade on that last cycle, I would immediately try to replace it with the image I wanted to work with, snapping the new picture into place the moment the flame impression started dissolving, as if speed was the variable that mattered. What I was actually doing was interrupting the most important part of the whole sequence. Because the fade itself, that slow dissolve of the afterimage as it softens and loses its edges and begins to blend back into the dark, is not the end of the process. It is the transition. The neural circuits that were just activated by the afterimage are still running at that moment. The pathways are warm, open, firing with the residue of the signal. And if you wait in that dissolving space instead of rushing past it, if you let the image fade at its own pace and stay present in the quiet that follows, you arrive at something that feels genuinely different from any other mental state I have encountered. It is not emptiness. It is more like standing in a room where all the furniture has just been moved out. The space is the same, but the quality of it has changed completely. Everything feels more available, more responsive. And it is in that exact state, in that prepared and open internal space, that the image you want to work with takes root in a way it simply cannot when the mind is unprepared. I discovered this by accident one night when I was tired enough that I simply forgot to make the switch quickly. I let the afterimage fade at its own pace, stayed in the quiet afterward without doing anything, and when I finally brought in the image I wanted to hold, it landed with a solidity that stopped me mid-breath. What happened when the image landed in that prepared space was unlike anything my earlier visualization attempts had produced. Previously, when I tried to picture a specific outcome, what I got was something flat and distant, like looking at a photograph of a place rather than standing in it. The image was there in a technical sense, but it had no weight, no temperature, no sense of actually being present inside it. What I got in that open space after the final fade was something structurally different. The image had depth. I was not looking at the outcome. I was inside it. And the difference between those two experiences is not subtle. When you are inside an image rather than observing it, Your body responds to the sensory detail the way it responds to real sensory input, because at the processing level, it is receiving the same category of signal. I could feel the surface of a chair under my hands. I could hear the specific quality of sound in the space I was imagining. I could sense the weight of the air, whether it was warm or cool, still or moving. None of this was forced. The detail generated itself once the state was right and the image was placed correctly. And the emotional response that arose from that detail was genuine, not manufactured, not performed for the benefit of some practice I was supposed to be doing. Just a clean, real emotional signal produced by a brain that was treating what it was processing as actual experience. That emotional signal is the encoding mechanism. It is the marker the nervous system uses to flag something as important enough to remember and reinforce. Without it, the image is just a thought. With it, the image becomes an instruction. And what I still had to figure out was how to close the session in a way that locked that instruction in, rather than eroding it. The closing step is the one that most people either skip entirely or get completely backwards, and getting it wrong quietly unravels everything the session just built. After the image has been held, after the emotional responses move through you and the 90 seconds have passed, the instinct is to hold on, to stay inside the image as long as possible, to keep running the session past its natural end point, because it finally feels like something real is happening, and you don't want to lose it. I did this for the first several nights, and each time I walked away from the practice feeling vaguely hollowed out, like I had been clutching something so tightly I had squeezed the life out of it. The letting go at the end is not an afterthought. It is load-bearing. Here's why. The nervous system encodes most efficiently when there is a clean signal followed by rest, not signal followed by more signal. Signal, then silence. The same way a key pressed on a piano needs to be released before the next note can ring clearly. The image needs to be released completely for the neural pathway to consolidate what it just received. One slow breath in, a full exhale that empties the lungs completely, the kind where your shoulders drop and your chest softens, and for just a moment there is nothing held anywhere in your body. And then the image goes, not suppressed, not pushed away, just released the way you release a breath, without force, without grief, without checking to see if it went far enough. What remains after that release is a quality of quiet that feels earned in a way ordinary relaxation does not. The room seems slightly more present. The candle, if it is still burning, seems steadier, and something in the chest sits differently, lower and warmer, like something has been set down that was being carried standing up. 7 consecutive nights. That is the minimum threshold I've found before the changes stopped feeling like events that happened during the practice and started feeling like changes in the baseline. The first 3 nights felt like learning. The next 2 felt like the system starting to respond. By night 6, something had shifted that I noticed not during the practice, but the following morning, in the quality of attention I brought to ordinary things. I was making coffee, and I noticed I was actually present for it in a way I usually was not. Not meditating, not trying, just there, aware of the weight of the cup and the sound of the water and the smell of the coffee, without any of it competing with a mental commentary running over the top. That kind of presence had always felt like something I had to manufacture through effort. That morning, it was just there, unrequested, running quietly on its own. That is what a conditioned pathway feels like from the inside. It does not announce itself. It does not ask for credit. It simply operates below the level of conscious instruction, doing the work your deliberate effort used to do, except without the effort. And what I want you to understand, the thing I wish someone had told me years before I found this practice, is that this is available to any nervous system that receives the right repetition in the right sequence. Not to special people, not to people who are already naturally focused or spiritually advanced or mentally disciplined. To any system that is given the correct input consistently enough for the wiring to change. The ceiling you have been bumping against is not a ceiling. It is a wall that was built from the wrong side, and the door through it has been documented and refined and passed forward across generations of people who understood something the modern world forgot. The candle is waiting. The question is not whether the method works. The question is whether you are ready to find out what your own mind is actually capable of when it has finally been given the right tools. So tell me in the comments, what is the one thing you have been trying to visualize for years that keeps dissolving before it takes hold? Write it down, because the first step to changing something is saying it out loud. If this reached you, subscribe and leave a like. There are people who need to hear this, and you sharing it is how they find it.